I am Lucas, and I am 35 years old. Exactly 1 year after I spent 3 agonizing years saving our family business from total bankruptcy, my own father looked me dead in the eye at a formal dinner, handed the entire $300 million company over to my entitled sister, and tossed a crumpled $50 bill at me for my effort. While I was practically living in my office, draining my own savings and skipping meals just to keep his dream alive, my parents told me I simply was not leadership material. They laughed at my shock, completely dismissing my sacrifices in front of my sister, treating my life's work like a minor household chore. But there was one thing they did not know: the revolutionary software that pulled Caldwell Enterprises out of the grave. The system they thought they owned? I never uploaded the master code to their servers. And right now, as you listen to this, they are facing total financial ruin, begging me for mercy. Before I tell you exactly how I legally and systematically dismantled the company I built, hit that like button if you believe in justice. And do not forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Now, let us go back to the night everything shattered. Family is supposed to be your safe harbor. That is the American dream, is it not? You grow up, you go to school, you work hard, and you build a legacy with the people who share your blood and your name. You share massive Thanksgiving dinners with the extended relatives. You chip in together for the college fund to make sure the next generation starts off on the right foot. You celebrate the big career promotion, and you stand by each other when the real estate market crashes or the corporate salary gets cut in half. That was the illusion I bought into. I bought it hook, line, and sinker. My father, Richard Caldwell, built Caldwell Enterprises from the absolute ground up. He was a tough, uncompromising man, the kind of guy who thought a firm handshake was a binding contract and that displaying any sort of emotional vulnerability was a fatal sign of weakness. I spent my entire childhood and adolescence trying to be exactly like him. I wanted his respect more than I wanted air in my lungs. But in our family, there was a very clear, unspoken divide. There was me, the workhorse, the reliable one, the son who was expected to fix things. And then there was Emily. Emily is 2 years younger than me, and she has never had to lift a single finger in her entire pampered life. The disparity between how we were treated was staggering, yet my parents always found a way to justify it. When I was 16 years old, I was stocking heavy cans on the night shift at a local grocery store just to pay for a beat-up, second-hand sedan that barely ran. I paid for my own gas, my own insurance, and my own repairs. When Emily turned 16, there was a brand new, fully loaded luxury convertible sitting in our wide suburban driveway with a giant red bow on the hood. When it came time for higher education, my parents somehow completely drained the family college fund to pay for her ridiculously expensive out-of-state private university tuition. They paid for her sorority dues, her European backpacking trips, and her luxury apartment off campus. Meanwhile, I was left to take out massive, crippling student loans and work brutal night shifts at a 24-hour diner just to scrape together enough money to get my computer science degree at a local state college. I never complained. I never threw a tantrum. I figured hard work built character. I figured one day my father would see my grit, my resilience, and my undeniable loyalty, and he would finally respect me for it. I joined Caldwell Enterprises right out of college, eager to prove my worth. At that time, the company was a mid-level player in the national logistics and freight industry. We moved heavy cargo. We managed complex supply chains for regional retailers. It was a solid, dependable business, but it was aging rapidly. My father was a man stuck in the past. He absolutely refused to modernize his operations. He hated new technology with a burning passion. He thought cloud computing was a ridiculous fad, and he believed that massive filing cabinets and endless paper trails were the only secure way to do business. By the time I hit 30, the entire logistics industry had moved on without us, and Caldwell Enterprises was bleeding money at a catastrophic rate. We were losing major, long-term contracts left and right to younger, tech-savvy competitors. The profit margins were shrinking to almost nothing. We were facing the very real threat of a massive lawsuit from one of our biggest clients over severely delayed shipments caused by our archaic dispatching methods. Employee morale was completely in the gutter. Department heads were quietly packing up their desks and resigning before the ship went down. The threat of Chapter 11 bankruptcy was a dark, suffocating cloud hanging over the corporate office every single day. I went into my father's massive, oak-paneled office and told him the brutal truth. I told him we needed a complete top-to-bottom digital overhaul. I explained that I could build a custom, proprietary logistics software that would automate our dispatching, optimize our routing in real time using live traffic and weather data, and cut our operational overhead by a staggering 40%. I laid out the math. I showed him the projections. He laughed in my face. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, looked at me like I was a naive child, and told me to stick to fixing the jammed printers on the second floor. He told me to let the adults handle the real business decisions. I did not listen to him. I knew that if the company went under, my father would lose absolutely everything. His retirement accounts, his legacy, his entire identity were tied up in that building. I could not let that happen. He was my father, and despite everything, I felt a deep, ingrained duty to protect my family's name. So, I started working on the software in complete secret. I worked my regular 50-hour week handling IT infrastructure and system maintenance for a salary that was insultingly below the industry standard. Then, I would drive back to my cramped, poorly insulated apartment and write complex code until 3 or 4 in the morning. I drank cheap, stale coffee until my hands shook. I maxed out every single one of my personal credit cards paying for independent cloud servers to run my logistical simulations. I even took the drastic step of cashing out my meager 401k, paying the heavy early withdrawal penalties, just to buy the high-end hardware I needed to test the predictive algorithms. I did not have a social life. I did not go out on weekends. I did not date. I barely slept. I poured every single ounce of my soul, my energy, and my financial future into that code. It became an obsession. Took me 2 long, brutal years. 2 years of absolute grinding hell. 2 years of watching my bank account drain to zero while my peers were buying houses and starting families. But when I finally brought the finished, fully functional product to my father, he had absolutely no choice but to look at it. The company was on life support. The bank was actively threatening to foreclose on the headquarters building. He was literally days away from calling a lawyer and filing for total liquidation. I walked into his office, set my heavy laptop on his desk, bypassed his secretary, and ran the simulation using our actual real-world client data from the previous quarter. I showed him right there on the screen how my automated system would immediately reverse the financial losses, cut delivery times in half, and salvage our relationship with our biggest remaining client. He stared at the screen for a long, silent minute. The color drained from his face. He authorized the immediate implementation of the software that very same afternoon. Within 3 months, the software completely stabilized the company's freefall. Within 6 months, we were not just surviving, we were actively profitable again. Within a year, Caldwell Enterprises was the absolute talk of the logistics industry. My system revolutionized how supply chains operated on a fundamental level, turning incredibly complex routing processes that used to take teams of dispatchers entire weeks to plan into automated tasks that took mere minutes. We expanded our operations globally. We secured massive, multi-year exclusive deals with top-tier international clients who were desperate for our new efficiency. We went from the brink of total, humiliating collapse to a staggering corporate valuation of $300 million. I was officially given the title of Chief Technology Officer, but in reality, I was the absolute savior of the company. I finally felt like I had done it. I had earned my place at the table. I had secured my future and protected my family's inheritance, not through blind entitlement, but through blood, sweat, and millions of lines of code. My father was finally looking at me with what I genuinely believed was pride. I thought the struggles of my youth were completely over. I thought we were finally a unified team, ready to take over the world. I had never been more wrong in my entire life. To truly understand the devastating depth of the betrayal that was rapidly approaching, you need to deeply understand how much blatant disrespect I willfully ignored along the way. When you desperately crave validation from a cold, distant parent, you wear heavy blinders. You excuse their terrible, toxic behavior. You convince yourself that they are just tough or old-fashioned or heavily stressed by the burdens of leadership. You lie to yourself because the alternative, admitting that your own parent simply does not respect you, is too painful to bear. During that entire miraculous year of unprecedented corporate growth, my sister Emily was nowhere to be found. She had spent the entirety of her 20s aggressively bouncing around major European cities, dabbling in a vanity career as a luxury travel blogger, and starting several half-baked, ridiculous boutique businesses that my father quietly funded with company money. When she decided she wanted to design custom handbags, my father wrote a check. When that failed 6 months later and she wanted to open an artisanal candle shop, he wrote another check. He subsequently liquidated those businesses when they inevitably failed, burying the losses deep in the company ledgers. Emily had absolutely zero corporate experience. She could not read a basic balance sheet, let alone understand the complexities of a global supply chain. She had never worked a 40-hour week in her life. The absolute closest she ever came to understanding the logistics industry was tracking the delivery status of her expensive online shopping packages. But the very moment Caldwell Enterprises started making headlines in major financial magazines, the moment the massive profits started flowing into the corporate accounts like a rushing river, Emily suddenly decided it was time to move back home. She started showing up at the executive office suite, wearing custom-tailored designer suits that cost more than my monthly rent, strutting down the hallways with a leather clipboard like she personally owned the entire building. She began actively disrupting high-level strategy meetings to offer completely useless opinions based purely on her personal aesthetics. She loudly complained about the color palette of the employee breakroom walls, while my exhausted engineering team was desperately trying to patch a critical firewall vulnerability to protect our clients' sensitive data. I brushed her behavior off. I told myself to ignore the noise. I figured my dad was just giving her a meaningless playground to keep her busy and out of trouble. I was far too deeply focused on scaling the software architecture to care about her office politics. I was managing a massive, rapidly growing department, dealing directly with international clients across 3 different time zones, and obsessively fine-tuning the predictive analytics to squeeze out another 2% of operational efficiency. My salary had barely bumped up. I was still making significantly less than the industry average for a CTO of a multimillion-dollar corporation, but I foolishly did not care about the immediate cash. I thought I was building massive equity. I thought I was securing my permanent legacy. Then came the end of the fiscal year. Our final quarterly profits had literally skyrocketed past even my most optimistic projections. We had a massive financial cushion, absolutely zero operational debt, and a rapidly soaring market share that was terrifying our competitors. My father sent out an email inviting the immediate family out for a special, celebratory dinner at the absolute most exclusive, ridiculously expensive steakhouse in the city center. It was the kind of elite establishment where powerful men in custom Italian suits cut massive real estate deals and corporate mergers over $1,000 bottles of imported wine. The kind of place where the waiters wore tuxedos and knew your net worth before you even sat down. I actually went out and bought a new suit for the occasion. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, tying my tie, feeling a profound, genuine sense of accomplishment. I foolishly assumed this grand dinner was specifically to honor me. I assumed this was the exact moment my father would formally announce my promotion to co-chief executive officer, or at the very least, present the legal paperwork offering me the massive equity share of the company we had vaguely discussed months ago when I first pitched the software. I arrived at the restaurant and was immediately escorted by the maitre d' to a lavish private dining room in the back. The dark mahogany paneled walls, the heavy velvet drapes pulling the room into strict privacy, the elegant, glowing crystal chandelier casting a warm, incredibly expensive light over the pristine white tablecloth. My mother was already seated, wearing a stiff smile and nervously sipping her sparkling water. My father sat dead center at the head of the long table, wearing a dark navy suit and looking incredibly pleased with himself, radiating absolute authority. Emily sat directly across from me, wearing a stunning designer dress, radiating a strange, smug, highly anticipated energy that immediately put me on edge. We ordered. The massive, dry-aged steaks arrived. The sommelier poured a vintage red wine that probably cost more than my first car. My father waited until the waiters cleared the room and closed the heavy wooden doors. Then, he stood up slowly, picking up his crystal wine glass and tapping his silver knife against it to command the room. I sat up straighter, adjusting my tie, a proud, expectant smile forming on my face. This has been a truly historic year for Caldwell Enterprises. My father began, his deep voice booming with absolute authority. A year ago, we stared the grim reality of bankruptcy right in the face. But we dug deep, we adapted, and we came out stronger, wealthier, and more dominant than ever before in the company's history. The future is incredibly bright. And because the future is so bright, it is time for me to start seriously thinking about the permanent legacy of this family. I nodded slowly, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was it. This was the moment everything I had sacrificed for would finally be validated. I am not getting any younger, and the stresses of this industry require fresh energy, he continued, looking around the table. I am officially stepping back from the day-to-day operations. I will remain chairman of the board, but the company needs a fresh, vibrant, dynamic leader to take us into the next decade. We need someone with a commanding public presence. Someone who intrinsically understands the modern aesthetic of a global lifestyle brand and knows how to schmooze the highest level of investors. I frowned slightly, a cold knot forming tight in my stomach. Modern aesthetic? Lifestyle brand? What on earth did that have to do with routing freight trucks and managing warehouse logistics software? My father turned his gaze away from me and smiled warmly, almost lovingly, at my sister. That is exactly why I am officially, legally naming Emily as the new Chief Executive Officer of Caldwell Enterprises. She will be taking over full, undisputed operational control effective tomorrow morning. The private room went completely, terrifyingly silent. The soft clinking of silverware against expensive china abruptly stopped. I literally stopped breathing. The air in my lungs turned to lead. I stared blankly at my father, waiting for the punchline. I waited for him to let out a booming laugh, slap the table, and say he was just playing a terrible joke. But his face was dead serious. His eyes were completely clear. Emily slowly picked up her wine glass, taking a delicate, agonizingly slow sip, her eyes locking directly onto mine with a sickening, totally triumphant smirk. "Wait," I said. My voice cracked slightly, breaking the heavy silence. "What?" My father looked down at me, his expression instantly shifting from joyous celebration to mild, condescending annoyance. "You heard me perfectly well, Lucas. Emily is taking over the company." "Emily?" I repeated, the name tasting like toxic ash in my mouth. "Dad, she does not know the absolute first thing about this company. She does not know how the proprietary software works. She does not even know how to log into the administrative dashboard. She has never managed a single corporate employee in her life. I built the system that saved us. I pulled us out of the grave when you were ready to give up." My father sighed heavily, picking up his steak knife and cutting into his meat like we were casually discussing the weather forecast. "Lucas, let's be realistic here," he said, speaking to me as if explaining basic arithmetic to a slow child. "You are great at technical things. You are an absolute wizard behind a keyboard in a dark room. But leadership, actual executive leadership, that is simply not your strength. You do not have the charisma. You do not have the polish. We need someone who commands absolute respect the second they walk into a boardroom. We need a brilliant face for the franchise. Your sister is the absolute best choice for the brand." "Charisma?" I asked, my voice rising in volume. My hands were shaking so violently I had to grip the heavy edge of the mahogany table just to keep them still. I sat alone in the boardrooms with the vicious corporate bankers when they were ready to seize all our physical assets. I commanded their respect when I proved my algorithms would increase their return on investment by 20%. I spent 3 entire years absolutely destroying my physical and mental health to build this empire. I developed the software that saved this company. Without it, you wouldn't even have a company to pass down. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her padded seat, her eyes darting nervously between me and my father. "Lucas, please do not raise your voice at your father in a public place." This is supposed to be a happy occasion for the family. A happy occasion? I snapped, staring at my mother in utter disbelief. Mom, this is blatant theft. This is a hostile takeover by my own blood. Emily let out a soft, incredibly condescending chuckle. Oh, Lucas, please do not be so incredibly dramatic. You will still have your little IT department to play with. I will make sure your annual budget is approved so you can buy all the little computer parts you want. We just need real, visionary leadership at the top to guide the ship. I felt my blood turn to absolute ice. I looked at my father, the man I had idolized my entire life, the man I had sacrificed my youth to save from total ruin. You are literally giving her my company. My father chewed his expensive steak, swallowed slowly, and wiped his mouth meticulously with a white linen napkin. He looked at me with cold, dead, shark-like eyes. It is my company, Lucas. Caldwell Enterprises. Not Lucas Enterprises. You did your specific job. You were an employee. You were compensated with your regular salary. My salary? I let out a bitter, hollow laugh that echoed off the paneled walls. My salary is 30% below the industry standard. I voluntarily took a massive pay cut for 3 years just to keep the lights on in your building. I funded the initial server space with my own personal credit cards. My father chuckled. It was a cruel, utterly dismissive sound that burned into my brain and that I will never, ever forget for the rest of my natural life. He reached into the inside pocket of his custom-tailored suit jacket, pulled out his expensive, thick leather wallet, and casually extracted a single crumpled $50 bill. He carelessly tossed it across the table. It floated in the air for a second before landing right next to my untouched crystal wine glass. For your effort, he said, entirely deadpan, completely devoid of any human empathy. Time completely stopped. The ambient noise of the restaurant outside our private room faded into absolute nothingness. I sat frozen, staring blankly at the crumpled green paper resting innocently on the pristine white tablecloth. $50. $50 for the years of brutal isolation. $50 for the terrifying panic attacks when the code would not compile. $50 for the entirely drained retirement account. $50 for the absolute, unwavering devotion to his legacy. $50 for single-handedly turning a dying, debt-ridden relic into a $300 million global powerhouse. In that exact, agonizingly slow moment, a profound and utterly terrifying clarity washed over my entire being. It felt like walking out of a dense, suffocating fog. All my life, I truly thought my father's approval was a tangible prize that could be earned through sheer merit and undeniable results. I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I was smart enough, if I sacrificed enough of my own blood and sweat, he would finally see me as an equal, as a man worthy of his respect. But looking at that crumpled $50 bill sitting next to my wine glass, I realized the horrifying, unvarnished truth. It was never about merit. It was never about hard work or intelligence or unwavering loyalty. It was entirely about control. My father did not respect me because he instinctively knew I was desperate for his love. He viewed my desperate need for his approval as a fatal weakness, a vulnerability to be mercilessly exploited for his own financial gain. Emily, on the other hand, who demanded absolutely everything from the world and offered absolutely nothing in return, was rewarded precisely because she mirrored his own narcissistic entitlement. He saw himself in her arrogance. I did not scream. I did not flip the heavy wooden table, sending the expensive steaks and crystal glasses crashing to the floor. I did not break down and cry. The anger expanding inside my chest burned so intensely hot that it entirely bypassed rage and crystallized into pure, calculated ice. Felt like a funeral for the son I used to be, and a funeral for the father I thought I had. He was treating the ownership of the company like a custody battle in a vicious divorce, and he had just awarded full custody to the spouse who had never even met the child. I see, I said. My voice was incredibly quiet. It sounded completely detached, like it belonged to a stranger standing across the room. I slowly reached out and picked up the $50 bill. I meticulously smoothed out the harsh wrinkles with my thumbs, flattening the paper perfectly. I folded it precisely in half, edge to edge, and then in half again. I placed it gently, almost reverently, on top of my folded cloth napkin. Then, I stood up from my chair. I calmly buttoned the center button of my suit jacket. "Lucas, sit down and do not be overly dramatic," my father scoffed, waving his hand dismissively through the air, clearly annoyed that I was ruining the celebratory mood. "We have a very expensive champagne toast coming in a few minutes." "I am not being dramatic," I said, looking down at him from where I stood. My heart rate had actually slowed down. My vision was razor sharp. "I am just politely excusing myself from the table. Clearly, my role in this family is nothing more than a convenient background character, a tool to be used and discarded. So, I will remove myself from the scene before I overstay my welcome." Emily dramatically rolled her eyes, letting out an exasperated sigh. "God, you are always such a massive martyr, Lucas. You literally cannot stand it when the spotlight isn't directly on you." I did not even look at her. I did not look at my mother, who was now staring fixedly at her half-eaten plate, refusing to intervene or defend her own son. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the private dining room. My leather shoes clicked sharply against the polished marble floor of the restaurant lobby. I walked past the host stand, walked out the heavy glass doors into the cool, crisp night air, got into my car, and drove home in total, suffocating silence. I did not turn on the radio. I did not roll down the windows. I just drove through the city streets, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white, my mind racing through a million different terrifying scenarios. I actually thought that dinner was the absolute worst of it. I naively thought the $50 bill tossed across the table was the ultimate final slap in the face. I thought the humiliation had reached its absolute peak. I was so incredibly, foolishly wrong. The next morning, I did not sleep in. I woke up at 5 in the morning, showered, put on a sharp suit, and arrived at the corporate office at 6:30, my usual early time. The massive glass and steel building was quiet, the early morning sun just barely starting to peek over the city skyline, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. I swiped my security badge, took the private executive elevator up to the top floor, and walked down the plush carpeted hallway toward my massive corner office. I needed to clear my head. I needed to sit at my desk, look at the underlying code of the software, and figure out my exact legal and professional next move. But as I approached my office suite, I immediately noticed the heavy oak door was propped wide open. I stepped inside and instantly froze in my tracks. My entire workspace had been completely, ruthlessly gutted. My dual monitor setup was gone. The framed photos of my college graduation and the early team building events were missing. The massive glass whiteboard where I painstakingly mapped out the complex logistical algorithms had been scrubbed completely clean with chemical cleaner. And sitting directly in my expensive, custom ergonomic chair, sipping an iced latte and casually scrolling through a social media feed on her phone, was Emily. I looked down. The heavy glass nameplate that used to sit proudly on the front of the desk, the one that clearly read Lucas Caldwell, Chief Technology Officer, was sitting carelessly at the bottom of the plastic trash can by the door, covered in coffee grounds. In its place, resting dead center on the polished mahogany desk, was a sleek, brand new rose gold plaque that read, Emily Caldwell, Chief Executive Officer. She looked up, startled for a fraction of a second, before instantly recovering with that same bright, entirely artificial, venomous smile. "Oh, good morning, Lucas. You are here awfully early. Didn't Dad tell you last night that I would be officially moving into this office today? The natural lighting in here is just so much better for my video conference calls." I stood perfectly still in the doorway, my jaw locked so tight my teeth ached. "Where are my personal things?" "Oh, I had the overnight maintenance crew box all that clutter up," she said casually, waving a perfectly manicured hand vaguely toward the hallway. "They took your boxes down to the 3rd floor. The 3rd floor." My stomach completely dropped. The 3rd floor was the windowless, heavily air-conditioned basement level, where we housed the massive physical server racks, and the chaotic bullpen of entry-level IT interns who handled password resets and jammed printers. And what exactly is my official corporate position in this brand new hierarchy? I asked, forcing my voice to remain dangerously, unnervingly steady. Emily tilted her head slightly, tapping her manicured nail against her chin, pretending to actually think about it. Well, we will figure something out eventually. Honestly, Dad and I talked, and he strongly suggested you take some extended time off. Go relax. Go to the beach. Maybe work on some of your little hobby coding projects. But if you really insist on staying busy around the office, you can head up the Tier 1 IT support team. We've been having some really annoying issues with the Wi-Fi dropping out in the main executive conference rooms, and I need someone to handle the router cables. Tier 1 IT support. In my own company. In the multimillion-dollar empire I had personally dragged out of the fire. She wanted me crawling under conference tables, resetting passwords, and plugging in Ethernet cables for her clueless friends, while she took complete, unearned credit for a $300 million valuation. She smirked, leaning back comfortably in my chair, interlacing her fingers. Do not worry, Lucas. You will still technically be part of the company in some minor capacity. We always take care of family, even the ones who lack vision. It was a blatant, calculated power play. It was a public execution designed for maximum humiliation. They wanted me out of the executive suite, but they desperately wanted me to quit on my own accord so they wouldn't have to legally pay out a massive executive severance package. They also wanted to avoid the terrible public relations optics of formally firing the very man who the entire industry knew built their core infrastructure. They wanted to torture and humiliate me until my spirit broke and I walked away with nothing. They were discarding me like a piece of useless garbage, like I was worth exactly the $50 sitting on my kitchen counter. I stood there and stared at my sister. I looked past her at the massive Caldwell Enterprises corporate logo etched perfectly into the frosted glass walls of the office. The name Caldwell was supposed to mean legacy. It was supposed to mean trust, blood, and mutual respect. Now, looking at it, it only meant absolute poisonous betrayal. I could have fought her right then and there. I could have yelled until my lungs gave out. I could have immediately called a cutthroat corporate lawyer, claimed wrongful demotion, and threatened to sue them into oblivion. But I knew my father's tactics intimately. He had a team of vicious lawyers on permanent retainer who would happily tie me up in frivolous, bleeding litigation for a decade. He had the corporate funds, he had the established power, and he had the sheer ruthlessness to bankrupt me legally. So, standing in the doorway of the office that rightfully belonged to me, I did the one single thing they absolutely never expected. I completely, totally surrendered. Understood, I said. I gave her a brief, incredibly polite nod, completely devoid of any emotion. I will head down to the third floor and get my desk set up. Emily's face dropped for a second. She looked profoundly disappointed. She had desperately wanted a screaming fight. She wanted an excuse to dramatically call building security and have me forcibly dragged out of the lobby in front of the employees to cement her absolute dominance. Instead, I denied her the satisfaction. I just turned around and walked away. I walked out of the executive suite with my head held high, my pulse completely steady, and my mind racing with absolute, terrifying clarity. They thought they had successfully buried me alive. They thought I would fade into the dark background and gratefully accept whatever pathetic scraps they decided to throw my way. As I stepped into the elevator, hit the button for the basement, and watched the heavy stainless steel doors slide shut, hiding me from the executive floor, a single, all-consuming thought burned like a raging fire in my mind. Watch me. The very first thing I did was vanish completely into the corporate machinery. Not literally, of course. I still showed up to work every single morning, right on time at 6:30. I rode the elevator directly down to the third-floor basement and sat at the tiny, wobbly particle board desk they had maliciously assigned me in the farthest, darkest corner of the building, right next to the noisy HVAC exhaust vents. I was entirely surrounded by 22-year-old, fresh out of college interns who spent half their paid hours watching TikTok videos under their desks and didn't even realize who I was or what I had built. I did not complain to anyone. I did not send angry, passive-aggressive emails to the HR department. When Emily's friends called down complaining about a frozen screen, I walked upstairs and calmly restarted their computers. I updated the firewall protocols. I played the role of the obedient, defeated, entirely broken tech guy perfectly. But I was not broken. I was a silent ghost haunting the very machine I had built with my own hands. From my tiny, pathetic desk in the basement, I still retained absolute, unrestricted administrator access to the company's entire internal network. I saw the massive data flows. I saw the emails. I watched absolutely everything. In less than a single week, I saw exactly what was happening on the executive floor, and it was a spectacular disaster. Emily was completely drowning in responsibilities she couldn't comprehend, and she was rapidly dragging the entire company down with her into the abyss. She had absolutely no fundamental idea how to run a complex corporate empire. Instead of relying on the sophisticated data analytics and predictive modeling my software provided, she began making massive logistical decisions based entirely on her instinct and gut feelings. She scheduled endless, entirely pointless mandatory meetings that lasted for agonizing hours, forcing department heads to discuss trivial rebranding efforts, new corporate logos, and luxury office redesigns while blatantly ignoring critical supply chain bottlenecks building up on the East Coast. When highly experienced, veteran department heads tried to respectfully warn her about impending logistical failures and contract breaches, she felt her fragile ego threatened. Within her first month as CEO, she completely snapped and fired our head of operations and our VP of client relations, two men who had been with the company for a decade. She immediately replaced them with her personal friends from her country club, people whose absolute only qualifications were knowing which expensive wine paired best with artisanal cheese, and who knew exactly how to nod and agree with every terrible idea Emily proposed. The established culture of the company turned incredibly toxic practically overnight. Employee morale plummeted into the earth. Caldwell Enterprises wasn't just vulnerable. It was actively bleeding out massive amounts of capital. The $300 million empire I had painstakingly built brick by brick was being blindly piloted directly into the side of a mountain by an arrogant captain who literally didn't know how to read the radar screen. That was the exact moment I finalized my decision. If my family did not want me at Caldwell Enterprises, if they truly believed I was entirely replaceable, I would build something massively bigger. And I would build my new empire right on top of their corporate graves. Late one rainy Tuesday evening, long after the oblivious interns had gone home and the corporate office was entirely dark, I quietly walked out of the building, got into my car, and drove to a rundown, all-night diner on the industrial edge of town. I walked past the counter and slid into the cramped back booth. Sitting there waiting for me in the dim light were three of the smartest, most ruthlessly capable people I had ever known in my entire life. Jake, our former chief financial officer. He was the brilliant man who had aggressively balanced the company books by a razor's edge when Caldwell was originally facing its first bankruptcy. He knew absolutely every corporate tax loophole, every complex financial regulation, and every hidden weakness in my father's outdated business model. Maya, the absolute best data analyst in the entire logistics industry. She had practically built our customer profiling system entirely from scratch. She could look at a massive spreadsheet of raw data and accurately predict a market shift 3 entire months before it actually happened. And David, my lead software engineer. He was the only person on earth who knew my software architecture almost as intimately as I did, because we had coded most of the complex API integration together at 3 in the morning, surviving entirely on cold pizza, cheap energy drinks, and pure, unadulterated desperation. All three of these brilliant minds had quietly, voluntarily resigned from Caldwell Enterprises over the past month. They weren't idiots. They saw Emily blindly steering the massive corporate ship directly into the rocky shores, and they wisely jumped into the lifeboats before the hull completely shattered. I slid into the booth and ordered a simple black coffee from the waitress. No one said a word for a long, heavy minute. The tension in the air was palpable. "All right, Lucas," Jake finally said, leaning forward over the sticky table, his expression dead serious. "We didn't come out here in the middle of a rainstorm for the terrible diner coffee. What exactly is the play here? I looked at the three of them, making direct eye contact with each. I reached down into my battered leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy, unmarked manila folder. I tossed it heavily onto the center of the table. "We are building something entirely new," I said simply. David frowned slightly, reaching out and opening the heavy folder. He began scanning the first page of complex architectural schematics, his eyes slowly widening in absolute shock. "Lucas, this is the core logistics engine, but it's fundamentally different. The processing speed it's exponentially faster. The predictive modeling my God, it's light years ahead of what Caldwell is currently using." "Exactly," I said, taking a slow sip of my hot coffee. Here was the massive, fatal secret my father and sister were entirely unaware of. A secret that would serve as my ultimate weapon. When I desperately built the software that originally saved Caldwell Enterprises, I quickly implemented version 1.0. It was highly stable, it was incredibly effective, and legally it belonged entirely to the company. Caldwell Enterprises owned the intellectual property of the specific code currently running on their physical servers. But I am not an idiot. I am a developer. During that entire year of explosive corporate growth, while my father was actively ignoring my existence and Emily was aggressively buying designer handbags in Paris, I never stopped coding. I spent every single night in my apartment developing version 2.0. It was a completely rebuilt, vastly superior software system featuring advanced artificial intelligence integration and complex machine learning algorithms that made Caldwell's version 1.0 look like an antique, broken calculator. And the absolute best, most legally bulletproof part of my plan. I did all of this advanced coding strictly on my own personal time, using my own personal hardware, completely and entirely isolated from the Caldwell Company network. I never uploaded a single line of version 2.0 to their servers. I never used company resources. The intellectual property for this massive technological leap belonged entirely 100% to me. It was my property. A lawyer could look at it all day and never find a single breach of contract. Caldwell has the outdated prototype, I told the group, watching their faces completely light up with the terrifying realization of what I was proposing. "We hold the entire evolution. I am officially starting a new company tonight. We are calling it Nova Systems. I want Jake running the financials, Maya heading up data strategy, and David as my VP of engineering. I am not offering you a standard corporate salary. I am offering you massive equity. We are going to take this new software, and we are going to pitch it directly to Caldwell's three biggest, most vicious competitors." Maya smiled, a slow, incredibly predatory grin spreading across her face. "You want to declare a corporate war against your own family?" "No," I replied smoothly, setting my coffee cup down. "War heavily implies that both sides have a fighting chance to win. This is not a war. This is a public execution." I spent the next entire month working in absolute, terrifying silence. During the day, I crawled under desks and reset router passwords for Emily's clueless friends at Caldwell Enterprises. At night, Jake, Maya, David, and I worked obsessively out of my small apartment living room, constantly refining the AI software, building aggressive, flawless pitch decks, and officially registering the LLC paperwork for Nova Systems. Once we were completely ready, we didn't just casually walk into the logistics market. We violently kicked the door entirely off its hinges. We specifically targeted Caldwell's top 3 industry rivals. We walked into their boardrooms and showed them exactly how Nova Systems could immediately undercut Caldwell's delivery times by a staggering 20%, while simultaneously reducing their massive fuel costs by a third. The corporate response was instantly explosive. Within 3 short weeks, we had 3 massive, incredibly lucrative offers sitting on the table. By the end of the month, I officially signed a $50 million exclusive licensing contract with the absolute largest logistics conglomerate in North America. Overnight, Nova Systems was fully funded, fully operational, and heavily armed to the teeth. And that was exactly when the foundation beneath Caldwell Enterprises began to violently crack. I actually thought my father's cruel betrayal would break my spirit. I thought that crumpled $50 bill was the pathetic end of my story. But as I signed that massive multimillion-dollar contract, I realized something incredibly powerful. They didn't bury me when they sent me to the basement. They planted me, and a massive, unstoppable storm was coming for them that they could not possibly survive. The first sign of the impending apocalypse for Caldwell Enterprises did not happen with a loud explosion. It happened with a quiet, terrifying whisper. For the first 2 months after my demotion, I continued to play my role as the defeated, invisible IT guy in the basement. I fixed the jammed printers. I crawled under the heavy mahogany conference tables to reset the Wi-Fi routers, and I collected my vastly reduced salary. All the while, Emily was enthusiastically parading around the executive floor, acting like she was a titan of industry. She was completely oblivious to the fact that the entire foundation of the company was rotting right beneath her expensive designer heels. You see, a logistics software engine is not a static entity. It is a living, breathing ecosystem. It requires constant maintenance, algorithmic adjustments, and predictive tuning to handle the chaotic reality of global shipping routes, volatile weather patterns, and sudden supply chain disruptions. I had built version 1.0 to be robust, but without me at the helm to guide the machine learning models, the software slowly began to degrade. It started with minor delays. A fleet of freight trucks on the East Coast would get routed directly into a massive snowstorm because Emily's new, wildly unqualified head of operations did not know how to override the automated weather protocols. Then, a major shipment of perishable goods was left rotting on a loading dock in Miami for 3 days because the system flagged a false customs error that no one on the current executive team knew how to clear. From my dark little corner on the 3rd floor, I watched the internal network traffic light up with absolute panic. Customer service lines were constantly jammed with furious clients screaming about missed deadlines. The threat of a massive, multimillion-dollar corporate lawsuit from our biggest retail partner became a daily topic of hushed, terrified conversation in the break rooms. I watched Emily desperately try to apply Band-Aids to a gaping wound. Instead of aggressively hiring competent software engineers to fix the core issues, she actually hired a boutique branding agency to redesign the company logo, genuinely believing that a fresh coat of paint and some positive press releases would magically solve a systemic operational failure. She was treating a critical logistics crisis like a bad review on her old travel blog. I waited until the exact moment Caldwell Enterprises secured a massive, high-interest bridge loan just to cover their operating expenses for the quarter. They were officially bleeding cash. That was the day I made my move. I did not ask for a meeting. I did not give a customary 2 weeks' notice. I simply printed out a 1-sentence resignation letter, walked up to the executive suite, and dropped it directly onto Emily's pristine, uncluttered desk. She looked at the paper, her eyes narrowing. "What is this, Lucas? Are you throwing another one of your little tantrums? Because I really do not have the time to coddle you right now. The board is breathing down my neck about these shipping delays." "It is not a tantrum, Emily," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any brotherly affection. "It is a resignation. I am officially separating myself from this sinking ship. Good luck with the Wi-Fi." I turned around, walked to the elevator, and stepped out into the bright city sunlight. I took a deep breath of the polluted downtown air, and it tasted like absolute, intoxicating freedom. 6 months later, the true reality of the situation finally came crashing down on my family's head in the most public, humiliating way possible. It was the annual Tech Innovators Gala, the absolute biggest, most prestigious industry event of the year. This was the night where every major CEO, aggressive venture capitalist, and powerful executive in the logistics and technology sector gathered under one roof. The event was held in the grand ballroom of a massive luxury hotel downtown. There were glittering crystal chandeliers, towering ice sculptures, and a sea of wealthy elites sipping incredibly expensive champagne, cutting massive real estate deals and corporate mergers in the corners of the room. I arrived wearing a custom-tailored, midnight blue tuxedo. I did not walk in through the side doors. I walked directly down the center aisle, followed by Jake, Maya, and David, my executive team. We were not just attendees. We were the absolute center of gravity in that room. Over the past 6 months, Nova Systems had aggressively, systematically dismantled Caldwell enterprises in the open market. We did not just compete with them, we actively hunted them. Armed with my superior version 2.0 software, we approached every single one of Caldwell's major clients. We showed them the undeniable data. We offered them faster shipping times, massive reductions in overhead costs, and a flawless, AI-driven predictive model that Caldwell simply could not match. One by one, the clients happily broke their contracts with my father and migrated over to Nova Systems. We were an unstoppable juggernaut. As the evening progressed, the host of the gala stepped up to the main podium, tapping the microphone to quiet the massive room. Tonight, we are here to officially recognize the true visionaries who are aggressively pushing our industry forward, the host announced, his voice echoing over the premium sound system. This year's keynote speaker is a man who entirely redefined the global supply chain. He took a stagnant industry, injected it with brilliant predictive artificial intelligence, and built an empire that is currently valued at over $500 million in record time. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the brilliant founder and CEO of Nova Systems, Lucas Caldwell. The applause was absolutely deafening. It rolled through the ballroom like a wave of thunder. I buttoned my jacket, walked up the steps, and stood behind the podium, looking out over the massive sea of faces. And that was when I saw them, sitting at a poorly placed table in the very back of the room, completely overshadowed by the massive pillars, were my father and my sister. They were not seated in the VIP section with the industry titans. They were relegated to the back with the struggling startups and the fading relics. My father looked 10 years older than the last time I saw him. His face was entirely ashen. His shoulders slumped in defeat. Emily was sitting completely rigid, her hands gripping her champagne glass so tightly I thought the crystal would shatter into a million pieces. They had spent the last 6 months desperately trying to figure out who this mysterious competitor, Nova Systems, was. They had watched their profit margins evaporate, their stock value plummet, and their legacy crumble, entirely unaware that the executioner holding the axe was the very son they had discarded for $50. I locked eyes with my father across the massive room. I did not scowl. I did not look angry. I gave him a small, polite, incredibly cold smile. I leaned into the microphone. "Thank you all for this incredible honor," I started, my voice steady and commanding. "They say that in business you have to ruthlessly protect your intellectual property. But I believe you also have to protect your own self-worth. You have to know when to walk away from a bad investment, even if that investment is something you spent your entire life trying to save. Because when you finally realize your own value, there is absolutely no limit to the empire you can build." I kept my eyes entirely fixed on my father as the room erupted into applause again. The trap of their own blind arrogance had fully closed around them. They thought I was a harmless IT guy they could bully into submission. They never realized I was the entire foundation holding their world up. And now I had kicked the pillars out from under them. It had been exactly 1 year since that utterly humiliating dinner. 1 full year since my father tossed a crumpled $50 bill onto the white tablecloth and told me I wasn't good enough to lead. 1 year since my entitled sister smirked at me, knowing she was being freely handed a massive corporate empire she had absolutely never worked a day in her life to build. 1 year since I walked out of that private dining room without a fight, only to silently win the entire war. Now, I was sitting at the head of the massive, polished granite conference table in the executive boardroom of Nova Systems. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the city skyline. I was casually reviewing our latest quarterly financial reports, and I could barely suppress a massive, deeply satisfying smile. Our annual revenue had just officially crossed the $320 million mark. Our overall market share was sitting at a dominant 48% and aggressively climbing every single day. Caldwell Enterprises, on the other hand, was violently bleeding out on the corporate floor. I had systematically, surgically dismantled absolutely every single competitive advantage they once held. Their most loyal, long-term clients had entirely jumped ship to join my network. Their corporate stock had plummeted to the status of junk bonds. And their deeply flawed, desperate latest financial report which had conveniently been leaked to the financial press just a week ago by an anonymous source, confirmed the absolute worst. They were teetering on the very edge of total, unrecoverable bankruptcy. At precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, the intercom on my desk buzzed. It was my executive assistant, Claire. "Lucas," she said, her voice carrying a hint of confusion. "Your father and your sister are down in the main lobby. They are aggressively demanding to see you. Security is asking if they should escort them off the premises." I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, letting out a long, slow exhale. It had finally come to this. The arrogant lions were finally starving, and they had come crawling to the very hyena they thought they had chased away. "No, Claire," I said, a dark sense of anticipation settling in my chest. "Do not call security. Send them directly up to my office." When the heavy oak doors to my boardroom swung open, they walked in looking like absolute ghosts. Emily was wearing one of her ridiculously expensive designer wardrobes, but all the imported silk in the world couldn't hide the deep, dark bags under her eyes and the frantic, nervous exhaustion radiating from her posture. My father, a man who had always been so incredibly composed, so absolutely certain of his own unquestionable dominance, looked physically smaller. He looked defeated. They had lost the corporate war, and they both intimately knew it. "Lucas," my father began, his deep voice carefully measured, desperately trying to project an authority he no longer possessed. "We need to talk." I did not stand up to greet them. I simply gestured toward the two sleek, modern chairs positioned on the opposite side of my massive desk. They violently hesitated for a moment. They could feel the intense power dynamic shifting in the room. For the very first time in our entire lives, they were walking into my territory, playing by my rules. They slowly sat down. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her manicured nails nervously tapping against the leather armrest. She absolutely refused to make direct eye contact with me. My father let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his face. "Look, Lucas, I know we have had our personal differences in the past, but at the absolute end of the day, we are still family. Blood is blood. Caldwell Enterprises is deeply struggling right now. The market has been incredibly unfair to us. We desperately need your technical help." There it was, the classic manipulative family card. Whenever toxic parents want something from you, they suddenly remember that you share the same DNA. They treat you like an unpaid employee until they are drowning, and then suddenly you are family again. It was the exact same manipulative tactic they used when they drained the college fund, or when they expected me to handle their personal legal issues during a messy custody battle over some disputed family land years ago. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out in the room for a long, agonizing minute. I just sat there, casually watching them squirm in their seats. Finally, I spoke. "And what exactly, specifically, are you asking me to do, Richard?" I purposefully used his first name. I watched him flinch. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on my desk. "We are entirely willing to officially offer you a major leadership role at Caldwell Enterprises. Something highly meaningful. A massive promotion. I deeply realize now that we may have vastly underestimated your executive potential." I tilted my head, feigning mild curiosity. "You realize that now? A year later? When your stock is essentially worthless?" Emily finally snapped, looking up with a tight, furious expression. "Lucas, stop being so incredibly petty. We need your help. Okay? The software is failing. We need you to come back and fix the code." I laughed. I actually threw my head back and laughed out loud. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed off the glass walls. "You need me? That is absolutely hilarious, Emily, because a year ago you both sat at a 5-star restaurant and explicitly told me I was not leadership material. You told me I was totally devoid of charisma. You told me I was only good for plugging in routers and hiding in a dark room. My father had the absolute sheer nerve to look frustrated with me. "Lucas, you know exactly how corporate business works. Difficult executive decisions were made based on the data we had at the time. But now we have to look forward. If you come back, if you bring your clients back to us, we can rebuild Caldwell Enterprises together. We can dominate the market as a family. There it was again. Control. They did not want to partner with me. They wanted to own me. They wanted to absorb my massive success to cover up their catastrophic failures. And what specific executive position are you generously offering me? I asked, lacing my fingers together, resting them on the desk. My father straightened his shoulders, puffing out his chest as if preparing to seal a massive real estate deal. You would be officially named Chief Operating Officer. You would be strictly second in command, reporting directly to Emily. But you would have complete control over the IT budget. I blinked slowly, and then I laughed again, significantly louder this time. Emily flushed bright red, her anger boiling over. Lucas, grow the hell up. You built some lucky software, fine. But that absolutely does not mean you know how to run a legacy corporate company at our elite level. You are just being spiteful. I instantly stopped laughing. I leaned heavily forward, resting my forearms on the desk, closing the physical distance between us. I made sure my voice was as cold and unforgiving as absolute zero. Emily, I said softly, my voice slicing through the air like a razor blade. My company is currently valued at over $500 million in cash and verified assets. Your company is mathematically weeks away from filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Please, I am begging you, explain to me again which one of us does not know how to run a company. Silence. Pure, incredibly satisfying, absolute silence. Emily's mouth opened, but no words came out. My father cleared his throat, his face pale. Lucas, please, we are going to lose everything. The house, the legacy, everything. It was that specific word that did it. Please, the very same arrogant, untouchable man who had routinely dismissed me, brutally belittled my life's work, and literally thrown a crumpled $50 bill in my face like I was an unworthy street beggar, was now sitting in my office, actively begging for his financial life. I had absolutely never felt more at peace in my entire existence. No, I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. Emily stiffened, her eyes wide with shock. Excuse me? I said no. I repeated clearly, enunciating every single syllable. I do not need Caldwell Enterprises. You desperately needed me, and you threw me in the garbage. You made your arrogant choice, you stole my inheritance, and now you get to live with the exact consequences of your own incompetence. My father exhaled sharply, genuine panic and intense frustration violently creeping into his voice. You are seriously going to just sit there and let your own flesh and blood completely fail? I did not let anything happen, Richard, I replied smoothly, leaning back in my chair. You personally destroyed Caldwell Enterprises the exact moment you put an unqualified, arrogant child in charge of a massive logistical empire just because she happened to be your favorite. Emily violently pushed back from her chair, standing up abruptly. Her face was flushed with absolute, unadulterated rage. You are just a bitter, pathetic loser, she snapped, pointing a shaking finger at me. You have always been incredibly jealous of me. You always hated that Dad loved me more. I gave her a slow, deeply amused smile. I looked at her expensive, failing designer suit, and then I looked around my massive, custom-built corporate empire. Jealous, Emily? I asked softly. I absolutely do not need to be jealous of you. I already took everything you ever wanted. I took your clients. I took your market share. And I took your future. I stood up slowly, smoothing down the front of my tailored suit jacket, towering over them from behind my desk. Now, if you will kindly excuse me, I have a highly profitable, multi-million-dollar company to run. The exit is down the hall. My father stood up. He looked at me for a long, heavy second, completely speechless, before turning and walking out of the office in absolute, furious silence. Emily stormed out right behind him. But right before she disappeared through the heavy oak doors, she stopped and turned back to face me, her eyes filled with venom. I really hope you are happy, Lucas, she spat out. I met her furious gaze with utter, unbreakable calm. I am. The moment the heavy boardroom doors finally clicked shut behind my father and my sister, I allowed myself a long, incredibly slow exhale. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out over the massive, sprawling city. They honestly thought they could just walk right into my absolute fortress, throw a few hollow, desperate apologies at me, offer me an insulting demotion disguised as a promotion, and expect me to come running back like an obedient, beaten dog to fix the massive mess they created. They truly had absolutely no idea who I had become. But as much as I deeply enjoyed watching them completely squirm under the weight of their own catastrophic failure, I knew intimately that this situation was not fully over. Caldwell Enterprises was rapidly dying, yes. But when a massive corporate ship finally goes down into the dark water, it has a nasty habit of pulling absolutely everything and everyone caught in its violent wake down with it. The real question I had to ask myself was, would I simply sit back and let that happen, or would I strike the final, fatal blow? The massive news broke exactly 3 days later. It was entirely inescapable. Caldwell Enterprises had officially declared Chapter 7 bankruptcy. It wasn't just a restructuring. It was a total, catastrophic failure. The news was plastered absolutely everywhere. It was on the front page of major business magazines, hotly debated in online financial forums, and running as breaking national headlines on the morning news networks. Former industry giant Caldwell Enterprises collapses overnight. How poor leadership decisions and nepotism sank a $300 million company. The death of a legacy. How greed killed Caldwell Enterprises. And the absolute best, most vindicating part of the entire media circus? Every single financial article, every single talking head on the news networks, aggressively credited the company's former massive success entirely to me. They all pointed out the completely obvious, undeniable truth. The only reason Caldwell Enterprises had miraculously survived its first near-collapse years ago was entirely because of the proprietary software I had personally built. And the second I was gone, taking the intellectual evolution of that software with me, it was only a matter of time before the dinosaur starved to death. I was sitting in a high-level strategy meeting with my executive team when my assistant, Claire, gently knocked on the glass door and walked in. "Lucas, I am so sorry to interrupt," she said, holding a heavily printed legal document in her hands. "But my contact over at the financial courts just sent this over. You are definitely going to want to see this immediately." She handed me the thick stack of papers. I scanned the dense legal jargon quickly, my lips slowly curving into a small, deeply predatory smirk as my eyes reached the final summary paragraph on the third page. Caldwell Enterprises was actively being fully liquidated by the federal courts. Absolutely everything was being put up for immediate auction to violently satisfy the massive, angry mobs of creditors. The massive headquarters building, the massive fleet of aging freight trucks, the remaining physical assets, and, most importantly, the Caldwell corporate name itself. My father was completely desperate. In the final, dying months of the company, he had aggressively over-leveraged absolutely everything he legally owned. He had secretly taken out massive, high-interest personal loans against his own sprawling real estate portfolio in a completely desperate, foolish bid to inject cash into the failing business. And now, the aggressive corporate banks were rapidly seizing everything. And the incredible, beautiful reality was, I had the liquid cash to buy it all. The poetic justice of the situation was almost too perfect to believe. That evening, as I sat alone in my massive penthouse apartment, looking down at the glittering city lights, I thought long and hard about what I truly wanted. I had already spent so much of my adult life desperately trying to prove myself. I had wasted so much precious energy aggressively fighting against the very people who had coldly dismissed me, brutally betrayed me, and constantly belittled my massive achievements. And now I had already won the corporate war. Nova Systems was a titan. My bank accounts were overflowing. I had absolute power. Did I really, truly need to crush my family any further? I poured myself a glass of expensive bourbon and stood by the window. I vividly thought back to that specific night, exactly 1 year ago. I remembered the exact, humiliating sound of my father casually tossing that crumpled $50 bill onto the table like it was a cheap tip for a bad waiter. I remembered the cold, dead look in his eyes when he told me I was worth absolutely nothing. And just like that, my final decision became crystal clear. I made my aggressive move the very next morning. I did not go through a massive, faceless corporate investment firm. I did not use a third-party proxy buyer to hide my identity. I wanted them to look across the table and know precisely who was taking absolutely everything away from them. So, I personally picked up the phone and directly called the aggressive bankruptcy lawyer who was legally handling Caldwell's federal liquidation. "This is Lucas Caldwell, CEO of Nova Systems," I said, my voice completely calm and strictly professional. "I would like to place an immediate, direct cash bid on absolutely all remaining Caldwell Enterprises physical and intellectual assets." I paused, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "Including the complete legal rights to the corporate name." The lawyer on the other end of the line audibly hesitated, the silence stretching out for a long second. "Mr. Caldwell, do you fully understand exactly what that specific legal action would mean for your family?" I smiled, staring out the window at the city I now owned. "I understand perfectly, counselor. Draw up the paperwork." Exactly 1 week later, I was sitting in the very same massive mahogany-paneled boardroom where my father had once aggressively ruled over his employees like a medieval king. Only this time, I was the one sitting at the head of the heavy table, holding the absolute power. The dense, highly complex legal paperwork was spread out neatly before me. A sleek, incredibly expensive black and gold fountain pen resting heavily on top of the final, binding contract. With a single signature, the entire shattered remnants of Caldwell Enterprises would legally belong to me. The massive corporate empire my father had brutally built, the exact legacy he so stubbornly refused to ever let me lead, was now entirely mine to do with as I pleased. Emily and my father sat directly across from me, separated by the massive expanse of the table. Both of them were completely ashen-faced, looking incredibly small and frail. My father looked like he had rapidly aged another 10 years in the past week alone. The deep wrinkles on his face looked like absolute canyons. Emily refused to look up from the table, staring blankly at her hands. "I still honestly cannot believe you are actually doing this to us," Emily muttered, her voice trembling with a pathetic mixture of anger and deep fear. I casually raised an eyebrow, not breaking eye contact with my father. "Doing what, Emily? Buying a massive, failed company at a heavy discount? Acquiring a corporate name that literally no longer holds any functional market value?" She scowled, her face flushing red. "You know exactly what I mean, Lucas. You are just rubbing our faces in the dirt." I leaned back in my heavy chair, slowly tapping my fingers against the polished wood of the table. "That is incredibly funny. I clearly remember, just a year ago, you did not think I was mentally capable of running a company. But now, you are acting like I have way too much absolute power." My father exhaled sharply, running a trembling hand through his thinning hair. "Lucas, just sign the damn papers. Put us out of our misery so we can try to figure out how to survive." I picked up the heavy gold pen. I paused for a long, agonizing second, letting the tension in the room build to an absolute breaking point. And then, I slowly slid the massive stack of legal documents back across the table toward my father. Dad blinked, utterly confused. Emily frowned, finally looking up. "What exactly is this?" my father asked, his voice shaking slightly. "A counteroffer," I said simply. He slowly picked up the papers and began scanning the first page. His eyes suddenly widened in absolute, terrifying horror. You are entirely dissolving Caldwell Enterprises?" Emily loudly gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "You are completely shutting it down? All of it?" I smiled. It was not a happy smile. "That is exactly right." My father looked like he might actually explode right there in the boardroom. "Why in the hell would you do that? You just paid millions of dollars for the infrastructure. You could rebuild it." I leaned forward, my voice incredibly calm and completely devoid of mercy. Because I absolutely do not need Caldwell Enterprises, Richard. I never actually did. My software was the only thing keeping it alive. But I do want one specific, highly valuable thing from this deal. I pointed directly to a single, heavily bolded legal clause on the very last page of the contract. My father slowly followed my finger, and his breath audibly caught in his throat. Emily violently snatched the document out of his hands and read it aloud, her voice heavily shaking with absolute disbelief. All remaining legal rights to the Caldwell corporate name, all existing physical patents, and all historical intellectual property will be permanently absorbed by Nova Systems and permanently retired from commercial use. She looked up at me, absolutely furious, tears of pure rage forming in her eyes. You are not just buying the company. You are literally erasing it from existence. I met her furious gaze without wavering for a single second. Yes, I am. Caldwell Enterprises would legally never exist again. The historic name would never be rebuilt. The corporate entity would never be resurrected from the ashes. It would simply, quietly disappear into the absolute void, just like they had aggressively tried to make me disappear into the basement. My father tightly clenched his jaw, his eyes burning with intense hatred. You are just doing this to get revenge, Lucas. You are destroying your own family's legacy just to get back at us. No. I corrected him, my voice completely level. I am doing this because some completely toxic things truly deserve to die. I pulled the documents back, picked up the pen again, and this time, I signed my name aggressively on the dotted line. And just like that, with a simple stroke of ink, it was entirely over. The Caldwell era was completely gone, wiped off the map. And in its massive place, Nova Systems soared, with absolutely no competition remaining from my father's failed, arrogant empire. 3 months had quickly passed since the day I legally and permanently erased Caldwell Enterprises from existence. 3 months since I aggressively signed that final, binding legal document ensuring the toxic corporate name would absolutely never rise again. 3 months since my father and sister silently walked out of that massive boardroom with absolutely nothing to their names. And yet, for the absolute first time since this entire nightmare began years ago, I felt a profound, incredible sense of peace. Nova Systems was thriving beyond my wildest, most optimistic projections. Without the constant, annoying threat of competition from Caldwell Enterprises, we had expanded aggressively across the globe, actively securing every single major client that had once been my father's absolute pride and joy. Our annual revenue hit $500 million. Our market dominance was sitting at a staggering 62%. My status as the undisputed leader in the entire logistics industry was cemented in stone. But the massive numbers in the bank account weren't what truly satisfied me the most. What truly satisfied me was walking through the massive glass doors of my corporate office every single morning and physically seeing a company built entirely on merit. Seeing brilliant, hardworking employees who were hired strictly because of their incredible skill, not because of toxic nepotism or family ties. Seeing a massive empire that I had personally built from the absolute ground up, without ever needing my toxic family's conditional approval. But as much as I desperately wanted to move forward with my life, the dark past had a very funny way of lingering, especially when the mail arrived. I received a thick envelope one afternoon. There was no return address, just my name written in a very familiar, shaky handwriting. I opened it up, and inside was a single, brief note from my father. Lucas, I absolutely do not expect your forgiveness for what we did to you. I know I destroyed our family. But I truly hope one day, when you are older, you will finally understand the pressures I was under. Dad. I stood in my office, staring at that pathetic, heavily manipulative piece of paper for a long, silent moment. It was the exact same toxic behavior, deflecting the blame, pretending his brutal cruelty was just a symptom of corporate pressure. He still did not respect me. He was just incredibly sorry that he had lost. I did not write back. I did not call him to yell at him. I simply walked over to the small decorative fireplace in the corner of my massive office, lit a match, and tossed the letter into the flames. I stood there and watched it burn until it was absolutely nothing but gray ash. A few weeks later, I received something else in the mail. It arrived in an unmarked envelope, a simple, elegant cream-colored card with heavy gold lettering. The annual Caldwell Family Charity Gala. I had honestly forgotten all about it. Every single year, for as long as I could possibly remember, my parents hosted the absolute most exclusive charity event in the entire city. Back when they still had massive wealth and absolute power, it was the social event of the season. But this year, my father was obviously not hosting it. The event had been taken over by the wealthy venture capitalist who had purchased my parents' sprawling mansion at the bankruptcy foreclosure auction. The invitation was clearly nothing more than a generated mailing list formality. No doubt, whoever was running the event now had absolutely no idea about the massive, highly destructive history between me and the Caldwells. It was a complete accident that I even received one. But instead of throwing the expensive card in the trash, I made a final decision. I was going to attend, not to prove anything to anyone, not for some petty, dramatic revenge, but to end this dark story once and for all, to finally close the book. The night of the gala, I arrived at the massive estate in my sleek, black car. I stepped out wearing a custom-tailored suit, carrying myself with the quiet, unbreakable confidence of a man who absolutely had nothing left to prove to the world. The massive event was just as extravagant as I remembered from my childhood. Glittering chandeliers hung from the massive ceilings, elegant classical music floated through the air, and a sea of wealthy elites sipped imported champagne like they still controlled the entire world. Except this time, I was undeniably the most powerful, wealthiest person in the entire room, and absolutely everyone knew it. Hushed whispers actively followed me as I made my way inside the grand hall. Is that Lucas Caldwell? No, he doesn't use that name anymore. He runs Nova Systems now. Didn't he completely destroy his father's massive company? I completely ignored the chatter. I wasn't here to impress the elites. I was here for one specific thing. And then I finally saw them. My father and my sister were standing awkwardly near the back of the room by the heavy velvet curtains. They weren't the center of absolute attention anymore. They weren't aggressively surrounded by powerful corporate executives discussing million-dollar real estate deals. Instead, they were standing entirely off to the side, a pathetic, fading shadow of what they used to be. My father looked incredibly small. His once booming, commanding presence had completely faded away, replaced by something I had absolutely never seen in him before: genuine, crushing regret. Emily, on the other hand, was desperately trying to hold herself high, wearing an older designer dress. But I could easily see the massive cracks in her fragile mask. The way her thin fingers nervously clenched around the fragile stem of her champagne glass. The way her eyes darted toward me in sheer panic, then quickly looked away. For the absolute first time in our entire lives, I was the one holding all the power, and they both intimately knew it. I slowly walked toward them, my shoes clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. Emily violently stiffened, looking like a cornered animal. My father slowly turned around, and for a split second, I saw something flicker deep in his tired eyes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't deep resentment. It was just absolute, crushing defeat. "Lucas," he said, his voice incredibly quiet, almost a whisper. I tilted my head slightly. "Richard." A long, heavy silence aggressively stretched between us, completely drowning out the classical music playing in the background. Then he let out a long, heavy sigh. "I suppose this is the specific part where you loudly gloat about winning," my father said, looking down at the floor. I smiled slightly. It was a genuine smile. "No, this is the exact part where I finally say goodbye to you." Emily blinked, her facade entirely dropping. "What? I did not come here tonight to throw my massive success in your faces," I continued, my voice calm and completely free of any malice. "I did not come here to aggressively remind you of absolutely everything you lost because of your own arrogance. Because frankly, your lives are absolutely none of my concern anymore." I casually set my expensive drink down on a passing waiter's silver tray and met my father's tired eyes one last time. For years, I spent absolutely every waking second of my life desperately trying to earn your approval, I said softly, but firmly. I almost killed myself trying to violently prove to you that I was good enough to be your son. I thought if I just saved the company, if I just worked harder than everyone else, you would finally love me. I exhaled slowly, feeling a massive weight lift off my chest. But I absolutely do not need your love anymore. I know my own worth. I turned my gaze entirely to Emily. She looked terrified. And I do not hate you, Emily. I genuinely never did. I just deeply, truly pity you. Her face tightly contorted. Pity me? Yes, I said smoothly. Because unlike you, I never absolutely needed to steal power from someone else to feel important. I built my own empire from the dirt. Her lips parted slightly, but absolutely no words came out. For the first time in her loud, entitled life, she had absolutely nothing to say. I gave them both one last, lingering look. Then, I turned my back on them and walked away. I did not walk away out of anger. I did not walk away out of some petty need for revenge. I walked away because, for the absolute first time in my entire life, I was completely, undeniably free from their toxic chains. I left the massive gala without ever looking back over my shoulder. I walked out into the cool night air, stepped into my waiting car, and told my driver to take me home. I was heading back to a massive company, a powerful legacy, and a brilliant future that was completely, entirely my own. I looked out the window at the passing city lights and I smiled, because this wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beautiful beginning. If you are listening to this right now and you are constantly, desperately fighting for the basic respect of toxic family members who only view you as a tool to be used, hear me now. You absolutely cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. Your worth is not defined by their inability to see it. Sometimes the absolute strongest, most powerful thing you can do is pack up your brilliance, walk out the door, and let them collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. Have you ever faced a similar, crushing betrayal with your own family? Did you stay and fight, or did you walk away and build your own empire? Share your personal story in the comments below, and do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you absolutely do not miss the next journey. Stay strong.